Hello, hello, advanced English learners. Welcome to this live conversation with Greg and MD, Mary Daphne. So, as you might recall, we talked about debate language in the most recent lesson that we put out. And so today, we thought it would be a great idea to talk about how do you confidently argue or express yourself or have a debate using pros and cons in English, right? Because this is important not just when you're in a formal debate, but also when you're exchanging ideas, when you're communicating with people, when you want to, express yourself and you might not agree with someone. In English, we like to not agree all the time. We like having that, back and forth, looking at different sides of the argument because it makes the conversation more enriching, more fun.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that pros and cons are a very effective way to present an alternative opinion
Yeah.
In a polite and gentle way, right? Instead of outright disagreeing with someone, you can use pros and cons to essentially say, these are some of the things I agree with you on, on this thing, right? Here are the pros.
Yeah.
However, there are a few drawbacks that I can see. Here are the drawbacks, the potential concerns, the red flags that I see, that might make this not a good decision.
Right. So pros and cons, can be a little bit tricky in terms of it's like using those words, right? You don't really say so if you're pro something, you're for something, right? You'll say I'm pro whatever it is. I'm pro equal rights, right? And that means that you're thinking about it as an advantage to society, to humanity,
a benefit.
Yeah, to the company, whatever, right? Whoever it is concerning. And then con is, it's the disadvantages, and you would
the
be
drawbacks.
Yeah, you'd be against something, right? So you're for something or you're against something, right? So that's the stance that you can take, right, in terms of a debate or an argument. But that's not to say that you don't change your opinion, right? And so maybe if somebody is, and that's why it's important to have these kinds of, exchanges with people, because if Greg has one opinion and I have another opinion, if I talk to him about it, right, in a very civil and polite way, with confidence and like I said, humility and being polite, then it's possible that he might sway my my own perspective on it, right?
Or you might sway my perspective.
Right,
Yeah.
or that.
Yeah,
So
and what I
it's a
like
good
about
thing.
pros and cons also is that it reinforces this idea that things aren't black and white in life, right? They're not one way or another. They're not binary, right? It's binary means like in computer language, there's a 1 and a 0, right? You're either on or off.
Yeah.
And that's not what life is like. In most cases, there's a lot of gray area, which is that space between, one opinion and the other. Between white and black, there's gray. And pros and cons do a good job of showing all different parts of a topic. Some of the things that the one side might agree on or feel strongly about, and some of the things that the other side might feel strongly about. And so it gets everything out there instead of presenting a very one-sided perspective on something.
Right. So when you're making your argument, don't just throw it out there. If you just throw it out there without being able to back it up, then it's kind of like a moot point, right? As we say in English, it kind of doesn't lead to anywhere. It's a road to nowhere. Whereas, and you're not going to be changing anyone's opinion or minds with that, right? A kind of like a blanket statement that doesn't mean anything. Whereas if you present a point, an argument, and by the way, an argument, when you present an argument, it doesn't mean to argue necessarily, right? That's something that's polysemic in a way, which we talked about last week. And so when you present an argument, it's presenting a point, right? It doesn't mean that you're fighting.
Yeah, you could think of an argument as like an opinion or a perspective.
Exactly. So when you present it, you want to be able to back it up with evidence, right? With research, with, strong supporting details, much like you would in writing, right? You have your thesis and then you have your points. So we talked about that in the debate language advanced English lesson, but it's really important, right? I think a lot of times we might be quick to disagree or quick to agree without really knowing why and without having enough supporting evidence as to why we might take one side or another.
Yeah, that's great. The other thing that's useful in this context is showing the other person that you see the full argument.
That's good. I love
Right?
that.
And so by listing out some of the cons of your argument along with the pros, you sort of preempt, which means you intercept.
Prepare them, kind of.
Yeah, well, you anticipate their disagreement,
Right.
and you preempt their disagreement with some of the arguments that they were already going to make.
Yeah.
And by doing that, it shows that you can see it from their perspective, that you're able to step into their shoes, right? To see things from their side.
Yeah.
And that makes them more open to hearing what you have to say because they think, oh, okay. I mean, this person actually, they know what they're talking about because the things I was worried about, they discussed that as well. So the point is that by presenting both the pros and the cons, you can demonstrate to the other person that you have a sort of a very well-rounded, holistic perspective.
Yeah.
And it'll make them more receptive, more open to what you're trying to say.
Exactly. Like you've done the research. You know what the counter argument could look like. There's a wonderful expression in English. You may have heard it. It's called playing devil's advocate. So it's an interesting one because it's about siding with the opposing side just to prove a point and to then turn around and say, but this is why I'm ultimately in disagreement with that because, and then here's why.
Yeah, you often hear that in the context where, or in this way. So let's say I'm having a debate with you. Maybe often it comes up in a situation where everyone's agreeing, right? So
and that's so boring, right?
know,
That's just
yeah.
like a really boring kind of conversation
Exactly.
to have.
So let's just talk about skiing. We both love skiing.
Yeah, let's do it.
Skiing is the best sport ever. It's just so much fun. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, but it's also extremely dangerous.
Right. So there, she's playing devil's advocate by she's bringing up the potential downside. She loves skiing too, but and typically, why don't you do it with me and I'll do it.
So I love skiing. Don't you adore it as much as I do?
Yeah, skiing is amazing. It's so good for your health, and you get the fresh air. I love being outdoors. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. What happens if I crash into a tree, or into another person, right? So they're
extremely dangerous.
Extremely dangerous, right?
So I don't think I want to ski anymore. Then
So we don't want to
you've
ski.
just convinced me. No, just kidding.
But often it's presented that way. So someone will actually outright say, "Let me play devil's advocate for a second," and it just means you're taking the opposite side for a short period of time to present a counter argument.
Right. And by setting it up that way, right, in the way that Greg did it, by actually, and this is how we normally do it, you are alerting people to the fact that this is not your opinion necessarily, but it is a point that you find some validity to and you want to present it to the group.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So it's a really good one to have in these kinds of debates and when you're talking about pros and cons. Because again, it adds some life to the conversation.
Totally. Yeah.
It doesn't make it, because the problem with also agreeing is that oftentimes it's not that everyone is in agreement. It's that it's because of groupthink, right?
There's pressure to agree with what everyone else is saying.
Yeah, because the harmony, right? We don't want to disrupt, we don't want to rock the boat. another great expression in English. Think about a boat, right? If it's on the water, it's very quiet.
Yeah.
It's quite pleasant, right? You can have your lunch, you can talk. But if somebody disagrees, that's going to rock the boat. And suddenly, you're off balance.
Food's flying everywhere.
Yeah. So these are really, fun little ways of thinking about, pros and cons. I want to share a couple of expressions with pros and cons. We have a few here. So you can say, right, when you're talking about something, for example, skiing. Skiing has both pros and cons, right? So it has both pros and cons. And that's really true of anything we can think of.
Right.
And so being aware of that fact is that you'll now open it up for discussion and see both sides and get to play devil's advocate.
So the phrase is skiing has both pros and cons.
Yeah, both pros and cons.
Okay.
Right? For example, being a PhD student has both pros and cons.
And you sometimes hear it has its pros and it has its cons.
Right.
It has its pros and its cons.
Yeah.
So it's like a possessive.
Exactly. Has its pros and cons.
Yep.
Exactly. And then the other one is to weigh up, right? To weigh up the pros and the cons of something. So what I really like to do, and this is very handy when you're trying to make a big life decision, you can, whether to move, whether to take that job, you can make a chart with pros and cons, right? So you can see, you can even have this debate with yourself confidently.
Yeah.
Right? So you can use pros and cons in a confident way, just as you're having this conversation with yourself. In fact, Greg and I like to do this when we're, making big life decisions ourselves.
Which we're always doing.
Which we're always doing. Or even if it's something like, should we order takeout tonight?
Oh, yeah.
And we make pros and cons and we'll talk about it. Seriously.
Yeah, you weigh out the differences.
So you can weigh out or weigh up the pros and cons. So you can make a list and you have a chart, right? 2 columns, pros, cons, and then see how much you have. And obviously, the column that has more items will probably be the stronger argument.
It weighs more, right? It weighs more. So if you're thinking about a scale, the more on one side, it's going to tilt to that side, and that's the side that's going to win out.
Right. So that's a really fun activity to do. So Sam weighed up or weighed out the pros and cons of moving to Australia.
Yep.
Okay. It's really, it's about taking stuff into consideration. So that really helps us take something into consideration and to think about it, right? The other one is on one hand, and then you say the pros.
Yep.
On the other hand, and then you say the cons.
I love that one, yeah.
Do you want to give an example with that?
Yeah. On the one hand, skiing is a ton of fun. On the other hand, it's easy to get injured, right? So, that's when I use all the time.
Yeah. Because again, it shows it's not black and white, right? There's this gray area. And even though it's both fun, but also dangerous, like you still want to do it.
Right. You have to weigh it out.
You weigh it out.
Yeah.
And the last one is that you can debate the pros and cons of something, right? So you can debate, you can, have a conversation about pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of something.
Yeah.
So again, debating is not necessarily like a formal, thing, even though
structured, sort of situation.
Yeah. So a debate by itself, the definition is a structured argument, but we also, and we have that, but we also use it just in the form of like a fun, activity that we'll do among friends or even with ourselves.
And there doesn't have to be a winner.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's not even about the winner, right?
Yeah, it's really about covering the topic and understanding the pros and cons.
Exactly. Unless you really want pizza that evening and you have to make an argument as to why you should order
Then
pizza.
you have to win that.
Then you have to win that.
Yeah, that's when you have to win.
Exactly. So hopefully this helped shed some light on using, the way we would formulate an argument and use pros and cons. And we gave you a couple of phrases that you can use. Remember playing devil's advocate on the one hand, on the other hand, and the other ones that we mentioned. So use it in your communication, in your conversation with people that you might be speaking English to. And let us know how that goes in the comments below. And with that, we'll see you next week for another lesson and live stream.
All right. Catch you later.
Happy advanced English learning.